first reading last Sunday was God telling Abraham in Genesis that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the sky. God then told him a verse that we did not hear in last Sunday's reading, because we skip around in the lectionary. If you ever look closely at the citation, very seldom do we go from start to finish like in the gospel we just heard. We heard a great deal of John chapter 4, but there were several verses that were not chosen to be heard in the Mass. Well, last Sunday, what God told Abraham that we didn't hear is that these descendants that would be as numerous as the stars of the sky would live as strangers in a strange land for 400 years. 1,000 years before Moses, God was telling Abraham, before he had any descendants, that his descendants would live in Egypt, where they were welcomed as friends and then treated as slaves. They were welcomed as friends after a famine struck their own land. It was the time of Abraham's great-grandchildren, the sons of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and his sons had become the leaders of the 12 tribes. Perhaps the land flowing with milk and honey, they were cut off at the source, and their crops were dying. Their rivers were drying up. People could not thrive there. They could not survive, and so they had to leave. They followed their brother Joseph into Egypt, where, as I said, they were welcomed as friends, but because the promise God made to Abraham applied to God's chosen people wherever they were, whether they were in the land flowing with milk and honey or not, pretty soon the Israelites outnumbered the Egyptians in Egypt. And Pharaoh was wary of that. He said, what if they decide to take sides against us with our enemies? And so he decided to enslave them. The Israelites went to bed one night as free people and woke up the next day as slaves. And it was just as God foretold. It would go on for over 400 years. During that time, all of those people living in exile would pray to God, please let us go home, send someone to save us and set us free. And finally, at the burning bush, God told Moses, go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And after all those plagues, because Pharaoh was hardened of heart and stiff-necked, finally, they went across the Red Sea, and they did not drown, and they did not get wet. And then they were put out there in what is called, quite appropriately, the Desert of Sin. And it should have only been a 40 days journey to get from Egypt back to Israel. Why did it take 40 years? Not because God lost his sense of direction. It's because the people lost their sense of who should direct them. We see evidence of that even in the first reading here today, as the people are complaining, as they so often did out there in that desert. It's too hot during the day. It's too cold at night. We were better off as slaves because at least we knew where we were sleeping each night and had a bed to sleep in, and we knew where our next meal was coming from. But in today's first reading, they're complaining about their thirst, and they want Moses to do something about it. All Exodus tells us is that 600,000 men followed him out to their desert. But surely they brought their wives and their children with them. There's over 1 million people that have nothing to drink. And they're looking to Moses and this invisible God and saying, what are you going to do about it? And God tells Moses to take that mighty staff that had been used to do so many things. And he said, strike the rock, and water will flow forth from it. A rock in the desert, the most unlikely place for any moisture, let alone enough to slake the thirst of over 1 million people. And so Moses did strike the rock, and God's providence was shown once again. And it saved their lives, because had they not gotten access to that life-giving water, surely they all would have baked to death in the desert sun the longer that journey went on. But this was a moment of great consequence for Moses. This story is told twice in the Old Testament, here in Exodus 17, but again in the book of Numbers, chapter 20. And in the Numbers account, God tells Moses, strike the rock. Moses does that, but he does it twice, as if somehow to suggest that once wouldn't be enough. We need that extra strike in order to make the water flow. God didn't like that. God did not like Moses, whom he chose to lead his people in covenant faithfulness, deciding he knew better and he could one-up God. And there was a grave and dire consequence for Moses. He was told by God in chapter 20 of Numbers, you will have to continue to lead these people, and they will continue to complain. They're going to make your life and mine miserable for 40 years. You will get them to the banks of the Jordan. You will be able to see the promised land across it. You will be able to smell its air, but you shall not enter into it. God was using Moses not only to lead his people through the desert, but also to lead them by example. And if Moses did not learn to trust in the Lord, how were they going to learn that same lesson? And so he would pay for that. Dead and buried on Mount Nebo at the age of 120, he would hand on the baton to Joshua, who would lead them across the Jordan, another body of water without them drowning or getting wet, another miracle, and then they would take possession of that land. But before they would enter into it, Moses, with his last breath, would tell them, if you want to have long life in the land you're about to occupy, learn from our mistakes. Trust in the Lord. Stop worshiping false idols. Stop turning away from him. If you honor him, he will honor you. If you keep his commands, he will keep you in your land. One reason why the Old Testament is so long, because they seemed to be incapable, or at least very unwilling, to even try to just believe that there is one God. All their other countries surrounding them, all the enemies surrounding them had a God for every purpose. And Israel knew they were small, and they felt very weak and defenseless because of it. And they didn't believe that one God could protect them and see all their needs when so many other countries had so many more gods than they did. And so this was a cycle that repeated itself all throughout the Old Testament, to the point where 1,000 years before the coming of Christ, all of that pagan idolatry would cause a civil war that would split Israel in two, and it would remain a divided kingdom until they were conquered by Rome and then eventually destroyed and dispersed all over the earth. It's into those circumstances that we enter into the gospel today, in the 4th chapter of John. Jesus going into a Samaritan town and dealing with the woman at Jacob's well. What is a Samaritan town? Well, once there was the civil war and there's a divided kingdom, there was the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital was Samaria, thus Samaritans, and then there's the southern kingdom of Israel with its capital, Jerusalem, and that's where the Jews were. That's where Jesus spent all of his life. Anytime he crossed the border into the north, he'd enter into Samaritan territories, which after that civil war were no longer viewed by the pure-blood Jews in the south as being people of the Jewish blood or of the Jewish faith. And that division became so bad that Jews from the south were not supposed to ever travel into the north. They weren't supposed to breathe the same air as those people or do any business with them. And yet we see so often in the Gospels that Jesus did exactly what he was told not to do, as if he was an outlaw to the outcast. He couldn't stay out of those Samaritan towns because he knew that he was sent to save them as well. Why? Because they were regarded as the least of God's people. And he believes the least will be the greatest and the last will be first. And the shepherd will leave the 99 to look for the lamb that is most lost, wounded, and wandering. So, of course, he was drawn to them like a moth to flame, and they to him. And Jesus is breaking the rules just by being in this town. And there's more rules that are yet to be broken. As far as the Pharisees were concerned, Jesus shouldn't have been there, and he certainly shouldn't have been talking to this woman. A man was not allowed to talk with any woman in Jesus' time without her husband or her father being present beside her. And yet there she is, alone at the well. But Jesus, he has a thirst, and so he's going to break those rules in order to try to satisfy it. And it's not thirst for the water at the bottom of Jacob's well. It's in 2 chapters, he will multiply loaves and fishes. If he was thirsty, he would not need human help in order to obtain a drink. What he thirsts for is the conversion of this woman who by her history has been looking for love in all the wrong places and never found it. She's been with all these different men, and now she's with another, and none of them are providing her fulfillment, and all of them are diminishing her dignity. And Jesus knows that, and he's about to change it. At first, the woman is confused and thinks they're just speaking about the water in that well. And yet it is when he reads her soul and convicts her of her sins that she realizes that she's in the presence of a prophet. When he forgives her for those sins, that's when she realizes she's in the presence of God. But what a wonderful transformation we see just in that one encounter, just at that well, just in that one day. That woman came there, thirsting not only for the water in the well, but thirsting for someone who would love her like she'd never been loved, and to forgive her for all the many faults and failings of her past. And it was being convicted of her sin and reconciled and forgiven by God for those faults and failings that made her a believer. And then what was the first thing that she did? She went off to go tell other people about the presence of God in the flesh. And that is a process that is meant to happen for all of us. That we are meant to be convicted of our sins and reconciled and forgiven by God for those faults and failings. And then we are to go be reconcilers. We who are forgiven become forgivers. We who are reconciled become reconcilers. We who have had encounters with Christ go and announce the gospel of the Lord so that other people can do the same. That's why this gospel occurs each year for the first scrutiny, for those preparing for baptism. Because much like that water in the desert that was life-saving and life-giving, the waters of baptism save our souls and nourish our faith with the sacramental life of the church that will help us to survive our refuge in this world still full of sin and death, so that we will get across the stormy seas to the safe harbors of heaven. But also, in particular, this gospel is chosen for the first scrutiny for those adults preparing for baptism, so they, like the woman, might find in Christ the life-giving waters that will lead us home, that will lead us to heaven, and will lead us to happiness.